is the Rosetta Stone. It was the key to understanding Egyptian hieroglyphics, and it is one of the most
You're about to hear a story that was never meant to be told. Not because it's fictional, but because for more than 2,000 years, it was deliberately hidden. What if I told you that one of the most famous objects in human history still hasn't finished speaking? What if the stone that unlocked ancient Egypt was itself lying? Before you decide this is just another myth or clickbait theory, listen carefully. Because what modern technology uncovered wasn't a legend, a metaphor, or a conspiracy. It was text, real text, carved by human hands and erased on purpose. Stay with me, because once you hear what was found, you'll never look at ancient history the same way again. And before we go any further, if you enjoy deep mysteries, hidden history, and stories that change how you see the world, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the like button. It helps more than you think, and you won't want to miss what's coming next. Now let's rewind. Picture Egypt at the end of the 18th century. The air is thick with heat, dust, and gunpowder. Napoleon's army is stretched thin, building fortifications, repairing crumbling structures, and desperately trying to hold territory that refuses to be tamed. Near a small Nile town known to Europeans as Rosetta, soldiers are tearing down the remains of an old fort. Stone after stone collapses into the sand. Nothing about this moment feels historic, until one slab refuses to disappear. Dark, smooth, unmistakably deliberate. A young French officer freezes mid-command. The stone is covered in writing, not random scratches, not decorative patterns, but structured, intentional symbols. 3 scripts, 3 voices, 1 message. The demolition stops instantly. No one there fully understands what they're holding, but everyone senses the same thing. This is not rubble. This is a message that survived centuries of silence. Within days, the stone is moved. Within weeks, scholars begin to circle it. And within a few years, the object we now call the Rosetta Stone becomes the most important linguistic key in human history. Or so we were told. Because what almost no one mentions is that the stone is broken. Not cracked by time, not worn by weather, broken selectively. Large sections are missing. Key lines vanish mid-sentence, and the damage is strangely precise. For over 200 years, historians accepted this as unfortunate loss, a casualty of age, a tragic accident, until computers got involved. Fast forward to the 21st century. The Rosetta Stone sits behind glass, quiet and complete, at least to the naked eye. Millions pass by it every year, believing its story is finished. But scientists weren't looking at it with eyes anymore. They were using light. Not normal light, but thousands of variations of it. Light from impossible angles. Light the human eye can't see. Light that penetrates stone at the microscopic level. And slowly, something began to emerge. Marks where there shouldn't be any. Indentations too shallow to notice. Traces of symbols that were never supposed to survive. The stone wasn't silent. It was whispering. Researchers built a digital twin of the artifact, a perfect 3D map of every groove, every cut, every imperfection. They rotated it, zoomed in, changed lighting direction, pixel by pixel, and suddenly, blank stone started forming patterns. Ghost symbols, not guesses, not imagination, carvings. That's when artificial intelligence entered the story. But this wasn't AI inventing history. It was recognizing it. The system had been trained on tens of thousands of known hieroglyphs: birds, eyes, serpents, crowns, ropes, each with subtle variations that only a machine could reliably track. The AI wasn't asked to translate. It was asked one question: what used to be here? Line by line, It began identifying damaged areas where symbols had been intentionally erased, not randomly chipped, not naturally worn, removed. And what it reconstructed didn't just fill gaps. It changed the meaning of the entire decree. For centuries, the Rosetta Stone was believed to be a ceremonial text, a polite announcement praising a young king, listing tax reliefs, temple donations, and religious honors, a harmless piece of political flattery. But the restored lines told a different story, a colder one. What emerged was not just praise, but negotiation. Not just celebration, but leverage. Not just religion, but control. The decree wasn't written for the people. It was written about them. And that's where things get uncomfortable. Because once the missing lines were reconstructed, scholars realized something disturbing. This wasn't a public message of unity. It was a contract, a deal carved in stone between power and belief. The young king, barely holding on to authority, wasn't being celebrated. He was buying loyalty. The priests weren't honoring him out of devotion. They were being paid tax exemptions, land guarantees, permanent protections written so they could never be reversed. In exchange, absolute ideological control. The temples would speak for the king. The gods would favor him. The people would obey. And anyone who didn't would be outside divine order itself. This wasn't myth. It wasn't symbolism. It was administration, the most ancient form of psychological governance. And here's the part that changes everything. The erased lines, the ones modern AI revealed, were the most explicit. They detailed enforcement, consequences, what happened when loyalty failed. Those sections were not damaged by accident. They were removed so history would remember harmony, not coercion. Think about that for a moment. The most famous translation tool in history was itself edited. And if that could happen here, what else have we been shown only part of? Because the Rosetta Stone wasn't unique. Copies of the same decree were placed across Egypt, in temples, cities, religious centers. And when researchers compared those versions using AI alignment models, they found differences: subtle, strategic, intentional. Some versions softened the language. Others removed lines entirely. A few preserved phrases that the Rosetta Stone lost. History wasn't written once. It was revised. And for the first time, machines could see all versions at once. That's when a chilling realization set in. Ancient Egypt wasn't just ruled by kings and gods. It was ruled by information control. And stone was the original medium of censorship. If you think this sounds eerily familiar, it should. Because this isn't just a story about the past. It's about how power has always worked. And in the next part, we're going to go deeper. We'll look at exactly what those missing lines said, why priests held more power than armies, and how this discovery forces us to rethink what divine rule actually meant. So make sure you're subscribed, leave a like if this story hooked you, and get ready. Because part 2 is where the stone stops whispering and starts confessing. Before we go any further, remember this moment. Because everything you think you know about ancient power is about to bend. The restored lines of the Rosetta Stone don't scream. They don't threaten. They don't sound violent. That's what makes them dangerous. Because true control never announces itself. When scholars finally aligned the reconstructed hieroglyphs with the Greek and Demotic versions, something unsettling became obvious. The Greek text, the one everyone trusted, was clean, diplomatic, almost gentle. It spoke of generosity, mercy, balance, a king lowering taxes, a ruler listening to his people. But the hieroglyphic version, the one meant for priests, not citizens, carried a different tone, not louder, sharper. Where the Greek said, "The king grants," the hieroglyphs said, "The king permits." Where the Greek said, "Honors are bestowed," the hieroglyphs said, "Duties are confirmed." Language wasn't just translated, it was filtered. And the missing lines, the erased ones, were the bridge between those meanings. One recovered passage describes something no one expected to see carved into sacred stone. Conditional loyalty, not symbolic loyalty, not moral loyalty, transactional loyalty. The priests were guaranteed land, grain, and permanent exemptions, but only so long as they fulfilled very specific obligations: daily rituals, annual festivals, public declarations of divine favor, constant reinforcement of the king's legitimacy as chosen by the gods. And if they failed? The text doesn't describe punishment directly. Instead, it removes protection. That's the trick. Without temple protection, a priest lost legal standing. Without legal standing, land could be seized. Without land, influence collapsed. The system didn't need violence. It needed silence. This wasn't tyranny. It was dependency engineering. And suddenly, ancient Egypt stopped looking like a mystical civilization ruled by gods and started looking like a highly optimized power structure. Here's where modern AI made a leap no human historian could have made alone. By comparing every known copy of the decree, not just the Rosetta Stone, algorithms detected pattern shifts. Certain phrases only appeared in priest-centered locations. Others only in administrative centers. The message was customized based on who was reading it. Same decree, different truths. The public versions emphasized generosity. The priestly versions emphasized obligation. And the versions placed near military routes emphasized order. This wasn't accidental. This was narrative targeting. 2,000 years before social media, before mass communication, before psychology was a discipline, they already understood something fundamental. Control the story, and you control reality. And then there's the king himself, Ptolemy V. History paints him as a child ruler, fragile, symbolic, propped up by advisors. A boy king praised by priests to stabilize a fractured land. But the restored lines change his role completely. He wasn't passive. He was precise. The decree reveals calculated concessions, not acts of kindness, but strategic investments. Tax relief wasn't universal. It was selective. Land grants weren't permanent by default. They were conditional, locked behind ritual compliance. Even mercy had structure. Prisoners were released, but only certain categories. Those whose freedom would strengthen public perception without weakening authority. Criminal justice as optics. Sound familiar? The stone shows us something uncomfortable. Ancient rulers didn't rule by fear alone. They ruled by incentives. And the priests weren't victims. They were partners. This realization shattered one of the oldest assumptions in Egyptology, that temples were spiritual sanctuaries standing apart from politics. The restored text shows temples as administrative hubs, tax warehouses, grain banks, and ideological broadcasting stations. Religion wasn't separate from the state. It was the state. And the people? They were never the audience. They were the outcome. The decree wasn't meant to be read by farmers or merchants. It was meant to be seen, displayed, monumental, imposing. Stone doesn't ask questions. Stone doesn't explain itself. Stone just is. That permanence created legitimacy, and that legitimacy shaped obedience. But here's where the story takes an even darker turn. When AI systems analyzed the depth and pressure of the carved hieroglyphs, they noticed inconsistencies. Some sections were carved deeper, slower, more deliberately. Those sections, the ones detailing priestly obligations, meaning the most important parts weren't rushed. They weren't ceremonial filler. They were the point. And the erased lines, they were removed later, carefully smoothed, not shattered. Which means someone, centuries after the decree was written, decided those details should no longer exist. Why? Because power structures change, empires fall, priesthoods lose relevance, new rulers don't want old contracts remembered. History didn't forget those lines. Someone deleted them. And until recently, they almost got away with it. What modern technology revealed isn't just missing text, it's intent. It's proof that ancient history was edited not just by time, but by hands that understood the danger of transparency. Because once you see how power truly worked, you stop believing in divine order. You start seeing systems. And that realization doesn't stay in the past. Because the Rosetta Stone isn't unique. It's just the one that survived. In the next part, we're going to explore something even more unsettling: how this discovery connects to other ancient civilizations, and why historians are now re-examining monuments once thought purely symbolic. If this story is opening your eyes, make sure you're subscribed and hit like. It tells the algorithm this kind of deep history matters. Because part 3 is where we ask the question no one wanted to ask. What if ancient civilizations weren't guided by faith, but by strategy? At some point, every myth reaches a moment where it can no longer pretend to be innocent. That moment came when researchers stopped looking at the Rosetta Stone as a translation tool and started treating it as a blueprint. Because once the restored text was understood as a system of power, not poetry, scholars began asking a new question. If this was how Egypt worked, where else did the same logic appear? That's when patterns started surfacing across the ancient world. Not similarities in gods, not shared symbols, but shared structures. In Mesopotamia, temple records show grain donations tied to public rituals praising rulers. In early China, oracle inscriptions blend divine favor with administrative commands. In Mesoamerica, monuments frame sacrifices as cosmic necessity while reinforcing elite authority. Different cultures, different gods, same architecture of control. And the Rosetta Stone suddenly looked less like an exception and more like a surviving manual. Here's the uncomfortable truth modern analysis revealed. Ancient power didn't rely on belief. It relied on predictability. People didn't obey because they believed gods demanded it. They obeyed because every social structure around them reinforced the same outcome. Food, land, justice, meaning, all flowed through institutions that spoke with divine authority. And Egypt perfected this earlier than almost anyone else. When AI models compared the restored Rosetta text to temple inscriptions across centuries, they noticed something striking. The language barely evolved. Not because Egypt was stagnant, but because the system worked. Why change a structure that keeps millions aligned without constant force? The decree shows this with surgical clarity. It doesn't threaten rebellion. It doesn't describe chaos. Instead, it assumes obedience. That assumption is power. The stone doesn't ask priests to cooperate. It assumes they already will, because the alternative is social extinction. That's what made the erasure of certain lines so revealing. The removed sections didn't describe cruelty. They described mechanisms. Once people understand the mechanism, the spell breaks. And whoever erased those lines understood that. But here's the twist no one expected. When the restored text was compared against later Egyptian decrees, historians noticed something strange. The same promises kept reappearing. Tax relief, temple protection, divine favor, over and over again, which raises a disturbing possibility. What if these promises were never fully delivered? What if each new ruler simply renewed the same guarantees, not because they worked, but because they had to? That would mean Egypt wasn't a stable divine order. It was a system constantly negotiating its own survival. The priests weren't loyal because they believed. They were loyal because they were embedded. And embedding is the most durable form of control. The Rosetta Stone, once fully reconstructed, reads less like celebration and more like damage control. A young king inheriting unrest, a priesthood demanding security, a population strained by taxes and conflict. The decree wasn't announcing a golden age. It was preventing collapse. And that changes everything, because it means ancient Egypt wasn't frozen in timeless harmony. It was fragile, carefully balanced, one misstep away from fracture. And stone was used to hold it together. That's why the decree demanded it be displayed everywhere, not to inform, to remind. This is the order. This is the agreement. This is reality. And reality, once carved into stone, becomes very hard to challenge. But now, for the first time in 2,000 years, we can challenge it. Because AI didn't just restore symbols, it restored context. By aligning decrees, timelines, erosion patterns, and political shifts, researchers began reconstructing something far more important than text: intent. And intent reveals fear. The fear of losing narrative control, the fear of priestly dissent, the fear of popular unrest. The Rosetta Stone wasn't about translating language. It was about translating power into permanence. And permanence is always a reaction to instability. So when we admire the stone today, standing quietly behind glass, we're not looking at confidence. We're looking at anxiety made eternal. In the next part, we'll confront the most unsettling implication of all. If ancient power structures were this calculated, how much of what we call history is actually legacy propaganda? And what happens when machines, not institutions, become the ones reading the past? Subscribe, like, and stay with me. Because part 4 is where the story stops being about ancient Egypt and starts being about us. Here's the moment where the story turns the mirror toward us. Because once historians accepted that the Rosetta Stone wasn't just translating words, but encoding power, a dangerous question surfaced, one that made many scholars deeply uncomfortable. If ancient history was curated, filtered, and selectively erased, how different are we really? For centuries, humans trusted monuments. Stone felt honest, permanent, immune to manipulation. Paper could lie, stories could change. But stone? Stone was truth. That belief is exactly what made it so powerful. The Rosetta Stone worked not because people could read it, most couldn't, but because they believed it represented something final, something unquestionable, something sanctioned by gods, kings, and time itself. Authority doesn't need understanding. It needs acceptance. Modern AI shattered that illusion in a way no human scholar ever could. Not by arguing interpretations, but by removing human bias entirely. Machines don't care about legacy. They don't protect reputations. They don't romanticize civilizations. They compare. They align. They reveal inconsistencies. And when they did, something became painfully clear. History isn't a record of what happened. It's a record of what survived. And survival has always favored power. The restored Rosetta text exposed a pattern historians are now seeing everywhere. Important systems don't advertise their mechanisms. They normalize them. Once something feels the way things are, people stopped questioning it. Ancient Egypt didn't rule through constant force. That would have been inefficient. Instead, it engineered dependence so deep that rebellion felt like self-destruction. Food distribution ran through temples. Legal recognition ran through priests. Social meaning ran through ritual. You didn't need soldiers on every corner. You needed belief that stepping outside the system meant chaos. That's the part that feels unsettlingly modern. Because today, we also live inside systems so large, so normalized, that we rarely question their foundations. We inherit them, participate in them, defend them, not because we were forced to, but because everything around us reinforces the same outcome. And just like ancient stone, modern systems feel permanent until they aren't. Here's where the Rosetta Stone becomes more than history. It becomes a warning. The missing lines weren't erased to hide brutality. They were erased to hide design. Once people understand design, they see alternatives. And alternatives are dangerous to power. The moment researchers realized this, a final realization followed. One that redefined the entire project. The Rosetta Stone was never just a key to the past. It was a test of whether future civilizations would recognize control when they saw it. For over 2,000 years, we failed that test. We celebrated the stone for unlocking language, while missing what the language was actually saying. Now, machines have passed the test for us, and that leaves us with an uncomfortable responsibility. Because if we can now see how ancient systems were built, maintained, and protected by narrative, we can no longer pretend we're immune. History doesn't repeat itself because humans are foolish. It repeats because systems work until someone learns how to read them. The Rosetta Stone finally finished speaking, not because we learned to translate hieroglyphs, but because we learned to translate power. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. If this story changed how you look at history, leave a like and subscribe. Not for the algorithm, but because stories like this deserve to survive uncensored. Because the past isn't silent. It's been waiting for someone who knows how to listen.